so much for joining us once again. This is the beginning of part 3 of our 3-part series on the state of the local church as well as the national church in America. If you haven't heard parts 1 and 2, I think it will be very helpful if you go back and listen to those before you jump into part 3. You know, one of the issues when we're dealing with, you know, kind of this theological faithfulness with kind of a type of ministry that's still culturally engaging is what we see with the Gospel Coalition and what I would, some people are starting to call the anti-gospel coalition. And one of the interesting things that I've seen recently with the Gospel Coalition is that they're having these good faith debates. And they're not at all. They're 100% bad faith debates because what has happened, and I've watched a few of them. I didn't have the stomach to watch a couple of them because I just knew it was just going to go down an unhelpful road. Is they always, and here's how they are tricky, because they have an agenda. They want you to feel a certain way coming out of it. So what they've been doing is they're picking someone who is known among certain theological circles, who's a little bit prominent and is very kind of studied and has presented their view on a specific issue to an audience more than one time. And that always presents what it's just obvious. It doesn't help to not say this. They present a leftist issue, a progressive leaning where the specific issue is concerned. And then you have the person that is, you know, supposedly on the right, and they're going to offer the more orthodox position where historic Christianity is concerned. But they always begin by saying either I'm not an expert on this issue or I'm not a very good debater. Right. And it is always an effeminate, soft-handed male who kind of just is used to taking the passive role in every conversation he's ever been in. And really, and we tweeted about this recently. I think you tweeted something, then I retweeted it, as is my practice. And it was a look at, and I don't even know what the guy's name is because no one's ever heard of him. Let's just call him Softhand McGee. And he was doing what was called a good faith debate with Jen Wilkin. But Jen Wilkin somehow did all of the talking. Yeah. And it was about the issue of education. And Jen Wilkin, who used to be super helpful where women's ministry is concerned, but she's of course gone down the leftist woke train, and she's a completely unhelpful false teacher now, especially on issues of sexual perversion. But on this issue, she defended sending your kids to public school, which, by the way, all of her kids are adults now. None of them are in the modern era of public schooling. And she was supposedly debating a man who was the advocate for homeschooling or Christian education or what have you. But all that you walk away from that conversation is you hear her side. Yeah. And in her side, what you hear is that, you know, you want to send your kids to a Christian, you want to send your kids rather to a public school so that they can be missionaries, but also I don't want my kids educated by Christians so that they can be saturated with what the world is really like. You know, it's just this idea that you're being a better disciple maker because you're showing them what the real world is like. And then she's like, when they come home, you know, I'm going to have conversations with them to teach them the Christian worldview because I don't want a teacher to be doing that. And A.D. Robles, of course, you know, he pointed out very well that she's saying she wants to send them as missionaries into the school, but then in the next breath, she's saying that she doesn't want the teachers of her kids to be Christians. And I pointed out one of these fascinating things, that this is what you always see with leftists where progressive Christianity is concerned, is they actually, when you look at the ethics, or the logic rather, of their statement, they are saying that they don't believe evangelism can be successful. Yeah. Because you can't both be somewhere as a missionary but also not want people to become Christians at the same time. Because if your kids are there as missionaries, then you're saying that the mission is for their classmates and the teacher to become Christians through the public witness of your family. And she doesn't see the problem in what she's saying. And this is how all of these bad faith debates are going, is that they have an agenda to get you to think that the people that believe conservative Christianity, the people that believe in theological precision, the people that believe in real family discipleship where kids are concerned and not throwing them to the wolves, they're always shown as weak. They're always shown as soft-handed. They're always shown as not having as many good points. And especially when you introduce a woman into the debate, it's just two very thoughtful men sitting on the other side, nodding their heads as if, oh my goodness, everything that you're saying is just so profound. You clearly are wiser than we are. And again, this is an underhanded attack once more, even on patriarchal leadership or complementarianism, is that these men are supposed to bask in the greater wisdom of the intersectional female. And it is just foolishness. But this is what's happening even further. I mean, I'm telling you, in the early 2000s, one of my heroes was Rick Warren. I literally gave out hundreds of copies because it was my job at the college that I was at. I literally, probably thousands of copies of The Purpose-Driven Life, used it for discipleship. I've recommended it to people for years. I still think it's a fantastic book. I think it's a great book on discipleship. I think it really shows you the purpose of life is to magnify Jesus Christ through making disciples to the glory of God. It's wonderful. But one thing that Jerry Falwell always told us is that the truth of your life is always going to be seen in the fourth quarter of your life. And because of that, and I know I've experienced it, we've experienced it together, your heroes don't always age well. Rick Warren has been unfortunately, a great example of someone, really a father in the faith who hasn't aged well. And he recently, of course, had a podcast with Russell Moore, who's always the worst person ever for Christianity Today. And of course, Russell Moore sat there just nodding along as if, oh, I'm receiving such amazing wisdom. Even though, as you've pointed out, in 2006, Russell Moore produced a peer-reviewed article on why we need patriarchal leadership. And Rick Warren, of course, is in trouble because the SBC has disfellowshipped Saddleback, because not only did they a few years ago ordain 3 women, but Rick Warren has retired. And what's fascinating is he still represents Saddleback as the lead pastor, even though he's appointed 2 other lead pastors. So I'm a little confused about that. But Rick Warren has ordained a husband and wife team to now lead Saddleback, and they are both the lead pastors, plural, of that church. And we've seen some ARC church planting network people that now that's their thing, is the husband and wife are both pastors. And Rick Warren said that 3 years ago that he was convinced, and he was very clear, not by culture, but by the Bible, that he's been wrong for decades about the fact that the Bible clearly only presents that men, or qualified men is a better way to put it, as the lead pastor. And of course, 1 Timothy 2:12, very clear on this issue. Paul wrote that a woman is not to teach or exercise authority over a man. But notice that text is never used in the conversation when men are, or when anyone is defending the egalitarian position that women can be ordained as pastors. And the reason that they don't do that is because 1 Timothy 2:12 is the silver bullet against the egalitarian position. They don't even try to explain what Paul meant. They're just basically very quickly say, oh, that doesn't apply in our age. And so I want to talk about the 3 texts that Rick Warren uses, or did use, to talk about the fact that he did this. Now, Todd Friel has also done a great quick video on this, but the first one that Rick Warren uses is the Great Commission. You have to jump through so many bad hermeneutics hoops to get to a place where you think that the Great Commission is talking about pastoral leadership, but that's literally what Rick Warren did. He said the Great Commission doesn't say that only men can make disciples, that only men can evangelize. This is to all disciples. I don't think any complementarian, I don't think anybody, the most fierce advocate of patriarchal leadership, never looks at the Great Commission and says women shouldn't make disciples, never looks at it and says women can't proclaim the gospel. You know, they never do that, but yet here's Rick Warren. And the problem that Rick Warren has is the context of this passage. The context of this passage has nothing to do with the ordained offices where leadership of the church is concerned. To argue that point is terrible eisegesis. He also pits 2 verses against one another. And this is what people never do. Explain to me then, Rick, how does Matthew 28 and the way that you're exegeting that text, how does that coincide with what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy 2:12, but also in Titus 1, also in chapter 3, where he sets out the qualifications of an elder. Where does he do that? So, Rick, what Warren is inevitably doing is that he's making Scripture contradict itself. But the fact of the matter is that you understand verses that are less clear by verses that are more clear. And so if you look at Matthew 28 and you get confused about gender roles where church leadership is concerned, then you look to where it's clearer about the specifics of church leadership. You look at, and even historically as a church, and this is what is amazing, you look at the pastoral epistles, because the Apostle Paul wrote them to young pastors so that they could put their churches in order. But then, of course, he goes to the day of Pentecost. Again, the text that he's going to make absolutely no sense. I would tell you, Rick Warren has been vilified for many years because people didn't like Saddleback's philosophy of ministry. And I always defended him. I said, I don't think you understand. I think Rick Warren's smarter than you think he is. And I'm eating those words now because the text that Rick Warren uses as a defense for egalitarianism makes zero sense. This is like a person that knows nothing about hermeneutics. But he says that on the day of Pentecost, God, was speaking the gospel through men and women. And so he's saying, he's like the sermons that were given that day. And if you look at the day of Pentecost, number one, there's no verbiage used for preaching of the men and women. First, he is talking about the speaking of tongues, which is other languages. And the term there was laleo, which doesn't mean to preach. It just means to speak. And again, not about church leadership. But when it does come time to preach the gospel, we then have to go to a man. We go to Peter. And interesting also isn't the fact that that God was so misogynistic that even though he's ordaining women somehow in Acts chapter 2, all of the apostles were men. Crazy. It's crazy. Then he goes to John 20:27, and he says the very first sermon that was preached after the resurrection was preached by a woman. Because in John chapter 20, I think it's verse 2 of chapter 20, actually, he sends Mary to inform the disciples. Again, the Greek word there is lego, which means to say or to speak. It doesn't mean to preach. But once again, Mary wasn't in a church. The context of this is so far from what John was actually talking about, even in the gospel remark. And then, of course, he goes to these two places where he says that's my exegetical reason for becoming egalitarian. But then he wants to talk about, and here is my practical reasons, that he doesn't want to be guilty of holding women back from their potential. And of course, what does he do there? He kind of gives you a passive-aggressive, underhanded, ad hominem argument where he basically is saying, if you're a complementarian, then you're a misogynist. If you're a complementarian, then you're holding women back from their potential, which couldn't be further from the truth, because in saying that you're holding women back from their potential, you are also then kind of ridiculing them for being mothers. You are underhandedly ridiculing the fact that it is not a low calling for women to disciple other women. It is not a low calling to teach other women. Yeah. It is not a low calling to teach children. This is a sad view that defames God's created order. It kind of looks at God's created order and says, I have a better idea than God has, and that God's been holding people back because of the way that Scripture is posed. But it's also inconsistent. Warren makes the statement, and this is what I think is so bad, because he's been disfellowshipped from the SBC, and his reaction is he now wants to attack Southern Baptist pastors. And he wants to say things, and I think he specifically said that the only reason you should be disfellowshipped is because of sin. To which my response is, and that's exactly what's happening right here, because false doctrine is sin. And you're promoting a false doctrine. The Baptist Faith and Message, which was ratified in the year 2000, sets a standard of doctrine around which it says Southern Baptist churches are complementarian and they are led by men. Now, one of the points I have to say this is we do have a few members of our church that are passionate about the SBC and that are even employed by the SBC. I'm passionate about the SBC. I love the SBC. I've given a lot of my life to this. But what I'm seeing is that now Warren is going to fight the SBC. He's going to go to the convention this year, and he's going to try to get his church put back in. That's the red line.
Yeah.
That's the line that I'm not willing to cross over, to where if through popular vote, that's what's going to happen, of the pastors and messengers gathered in New Orleans, if they undo the disfellowshipping, then the Southern Baptist Convention is then going to become an egalitarian convention that is literally saying our statement of faith isn't worth the paper that it's printed on.
It's the polarization that we were talking about in previous episodes. Like, there's no third way between we allow women to be pastors and we don't allow women to be pastors.
Well, how are we at a place where people are struggling with gender identity? Because Christians are obfuscating. They're obscuring the line between male and female. When you look at male and female and you say they're equal both in purpose and in function, you are taking away the beauty of God's good design. And one of the sad things that I'm going to say just as a Southern Baptist is that you're seeing the network heads, especially where the North American Mission Board is concerned, they're not on the side of the Bible. They're on the side of egalitarianism. The Southern Baptist Convention over the last 5 to 10 years has gone from a convention that was clearly representative and led purposefully by churches to a convention that is led by the entities and the denominational employees.
Yeah.
That's a bad design, because people who are receiving a paycheck from the denomination are not going to be willing to stand up against the entity that feeds their family.
Yeah.
They're not going to be able to do it. That's why the SBC has been set up to where it is people that lead the churches who aren't dependent on the denomination that lead it. But now I'm cynical in the way that I think this Saddleback Church thing is going to play out. And just to warn people, if it plays out, and by God's grace, I hope that it plays out in where this stands and Saddleback is disfellowship. But here's the key. It's not just Saddleback. All egalitarian SBC churches need to be expelled from the convention. That is the clear standard of our doctrinal statement. And, we have 2 SBC state conventions in Virginia. One that was literally started, the Southern Baptist Conservatives of Virginia, was started in the 90s with this as one of their banner issues. And I will tell you, conversations through the denominational employees of the state convention, that they are not wanting to fight this. And so the SBCV is now being obscured with the Liberal Convention of Virginia, the BGAV. And the BGAV, which is egalitarian, which doesn't accept the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, it should not be a state convention.
No.
They should be disfellowshipped too. And all that to say that if now we obscure this and it becomes an egalitarian network, which, by the way, refusing to disfellowship a church over this, we're not going to stay.
No.
There's nothing for us there.
So when we're talking about the state of the evangelical church, that's why we're bringing all this up. That's why this matters. These issues with these ridiculous gospel coalition debates, and now Rick Warren, vowing that he's going to take his disfellowship to the convention and fight it. This is these are microcosms, but they're still huge issues of what's happening in the larger evangelical church. And so, we just need to tell our people this is happening out there. We protect you from some of this so you don't see this happening.
This is about biblical fidelity.
But the stuff that happens out there matters, and it will be disastrous for the SBC if they vote to reinstate Saddleback Church.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing that everybody needs to be careful of, and this is why I would hope that they start to right the ship, is we were looking at cooperative program giving, which is what runs the entities as well as the state conventions for 2023 so far. And what was the number? It went down so much.
Like 15% in February, which is, when you're talking about the amount of money we're talking about, 15% is huge.
Yeah, and we've already designated our funding away from NAM. I know that doesn't work in an application, but in theory, it makes a statement. But more churches are joining us, and the SBC needs to realize that conservative theology isn't a bug. Conservative theology is the design. It's the way, it's a feature. It's the way it's supposed to be. And of course, we, along with other people, warned about the trajectory of guys like Rick Warren, warned about the trajectory of guys like Russell Moore years ago, and nobody would listen. You're saying, oh, you're just one of those discernment bloggers.
Yeah, all this stuff matters. And it does go back to the votes the last few years matters. I mean, frankly, it's been shameful that the SBC president hasn't spoken boldly about the Rick Warren situation.
Absolutely.
What's preventing him from doing that?
He's a coward.
That's it.
He's also not very smart.
Yep.
I've heard him talk many times. He's unintelligent.
We got problems if we don't right the ship.
Yeah, and that is why we have such a focus on seeking to disciple and train up bold and courageous men.
Yep.
We strengthen and encourage men at Village Church so that they can be fierce fathers who are shepherds of their family, but also so that we can raise up leaders and future leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ. And we're unapologetic rather about that.
Yep. Unapologetic about our ministry to men. We seek to reach men and via that the family. We do not apologize here for pouring into men more because, one, we are men, and two, we believe that that is the biblical model of ministry. We teach men who then lead their families. And for things that women do need specific instruction on, we even have scripture for that. Titus 2, wiser women are to be discipling other women.
Again, God's design is a feature. It's not a bug.
Yeah.
You need to celebrate the differences between men and women. You know, I can boldly proclaim to the world, I have never questioned whether or not I am a man or not. It is something I've been confident of my whole life. Oh, absolutely. I hope other people are too. But now we live in an era where it's now encouraged, oh, you've questioned that? That's great. Maybe you should lean into a different type of gender identity. But that road and the trajectory towards it begins at not looking at God's good design for women to be nurturers, to be mothers, to raise up good families. When you don't look at that as the glory of a woman, you are susceptible to the perversion of gender identity in the culture around you.
We're going to seek to be clear about these issues. Here's what I want to say about men's ministry at Village Church. We are about speaking directly to the real issues happening in society and encouraging men to be ambitious with their lives. All right, men's ministry is not about eating wild game and hearing from half-literate former football players.
Yeah.
And I'll just say it. I was so discouraged by the most recent Thomas Road Baptist Church men's event.
But it wasn't just Thomas Road because the SBC of Virginia advertised it for them.
A lot. And so they featured 3 football players, one of whom killed a guy, an MMA guy, and 2 egalitarian pastors. That if that's your men's ministry, you're failing.
Oh, 100%. I'm saddened. And again, trajectory. If you look back in the late 70s, early 80s, Thomas Road Baptist Church was a beacon of Christian morality, was a beacon of what was referred to as fundamentalism, which I believed was very healthy. They have devolved from Francis Schaeffer being one of the biggest people that they would bring in to teach the men of Thomas Road Baptist Church and teach the men of Liberty University to they've gone from Francis Schaeffer to Ray Lewis.
Yeah.
And an MMA guy. It's just like, this is the state of the church in 2023. We don't want to hear from apologists. We don't want to hear from theologians who are defending the faith against an atheistic worldview. Instead, we want to just gather all the teenage guys because isn't it cool? We have a former football player. It saddens me.
Yeah, you're not going to.
It breaks my heart.
Keep them in the faith. That we got to do better. If your men's ministry isn't talking about the cultural rot gut infecting our society and especially government schools, you're not equipping men to lead. You're just playing games. If your men's ministry isn't telling dads to protect their kids from the LGBT mafia, it's a fraud.
Yeah, you hear so much about the failure of youth ministry, yet everything that we see about men's ministry is just recycled rah-rah sessions where you're like, hey, look, following Jesus is actually cool, and following Jesus is actually what men do, and if you follow Jesus, you're going to have a great life like I have.
Yeah.
That is not the gospel. That is failure.
We got to talk about the real things that are facing men. We've got men who are dealing with DEI nonsense in their works that is actually threatening their careers. We're not talking about that wokeness infecting the culture. You're not encouraging men.
No, if you're not teaching your dads how to protect their families from the LGBTQ plus mafia that's invading the public schools, the critical theory experts that are going into your schools trying to groom your children, not just towards sexual perversion, but towards a materialistic worldview where they will even deny the existence of God, then your men's ministry is bankrupt. It's useless.
And that's what I have to say about the evangelical church as a whole right now. I'm tired of seeing men's ministries that won't confront progressive rot. We need to teach men to not be effeminate. That's another thing. This is the And Another Thing podcast series of episodes. If your men's ministry is not talking about effeminacy, it's not a men's ministry.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I've noticed as having young men come up in our church and seek discipleship is I didn't realize that I was going to have to disciple guys away from effeminate attributes.
Yeah.
Where not only are they not to be effeminate in their emotions, but they're not to be effeminate in their actions.
Yeah.
We have a legion, an army of young men who have been conditioned their entire lives that they are emotionally equivalent to effeminate women, that they are to exhibit the same type of hormonal attributes that women do. And so we have a legion of young men, really young boys, who think that anxiety is a reason why they can't function in the world. And it's like, if you look at human history, that's never been a problem before. And if you don't think that you need to disciple your men to stop believing that they can be emotional wrecks and still be called men, then you don't understand what biblical manhood is all about.
Church has got to stop wasting our time. The evangelical church is by and large a place where men don't want to be.
Yeah.
The programs are too corny and cheesy. We waste too much time. I almost don't even know what else to say here because the effeminacy of the evangelical church is so overwhelming, it does get discouraging. And you go to a lot of church conferences and denominational meetings, and it's soft words given by soft men with soft hands. And the feminization of the church just has to stop if we're going to confront what's coming for us from the culture. There's always this felt need to qualify that with, and we're not talking about, teaching machoism, but actually, I'm going to go down a different path. I am talking about teaching a guy how to be macho. I am talking about teaching guys how to walk around with a little bit of machismo. It is machismo that has freed societies that were under the rule of dictators over the history of the world. It is machismo that really was an attribute that Jesus Christ had when he had to face being persecuted under the hands of Roman soldiers and being nailed to a wooden cross. It was not effeminate sensibilities that led Jesus to that cross. It was a macho aspect of being a man. Men need to be taught to endure pain. Men need to be taught to stop making excuses like you're a little girl. Yeah. And we should use that type of language, and women shouldn't be offended when we use that type of language because men stand in front. Yeah. Men don't give excuses. And this doesn't mean that we're kind of the stereotype of the early Mark Driscoll area where we're just yelling at men and telling them to grow up and stop being babies. They need some of that. A lot of this is about encouragement and telling them God created you as a man, and that is a good thing, and you can lead.
In a world that is beating men into submission, beating men into being effeminate, we are exposing men to the beauty of manhood, to say this is God's good design for you. This is not something that you throw off so that you can syncretize with a feminine world. This is something that you take hold of and celebrate because masculinity, biblical masculinity, is a wonderful thing.
Yeah. I won't dwell on this a long time, but all throughout evangelical institutions over the last few decades, we've seen feminization. And it happens with honestly putting women in positions that they shouldn't be. And we've done this because we've rejected God's creation design. We've isolated it even into just the pastoral office, even though we're losing ground there, just the home. But you look at things like just the committees of churches and how they're run, dominated by women. Even our own denomination, the most important and critical committees in the SBC are led by and majority women run. That's a huge problem.
That's a huge problem, because if there is no greater office for a pastor than making decisions for churches, that is what the office of pastor is. That's what you do. And so when you look at the denominational leadership, you should not be ordaining women to making decisions for churches at large. That is when you limit complementarianism to just the office of a pastor, and you say, well, we have freedom to ordain women to the offices that determine how the office of pastor goes, then you've lost the script. You don't understand what God's design is all about. And that's a general sense of God's design. You just have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yep. That's just one example of feminization, but you see it everywhere. All right, last thing let's talk about. State of the local church, state of the evangelical church is leadership. As the church grows, we have got to raise up new leaders. We need to train pastors.
Yeah, we saw a statistic last week, or 2 weeks ago, I think it was, that you showed it to me, where our Southern Baptist seminaries, the enrollment is plummeting at every single one of them. I think SEBTS's enrollment actually went down by 40%. That's Southeastern, if you don't know, but it went down by 40%. And one of the reasons is because SBC has gone woke. Danny Aiken's a bad leader. He's not leading Southeastern very well. And so they've lost students because young men don't want to go into ministry because they want to actually have lives of masculinity. And so when you look at the effeminate way that pastors are being trained, and you look at the effeminate nature where the lines are being obscured, why would a young man want to go into ministry? And so we are seeing a lack of leaders being raised up in the local church because we're seeing a lack of masculinity in the pastoral office, and especially in the nationwide or national leaders, rather, of the denomination.
Yep. So when we think about seeing that and just what is the state of our local church, Village Church, where do we want it to go? Absolutely. We want to grow our teaching ministry.
We need to train pastors. We need to train leaders.
Yep. We need more preaching pastors.
Yeah.
All right. That's just reality. I know it's a passion of yours, and it's one that I fully affirm and support. Is we've got to figure out, how do we, and we mean this as our church, but then broader, to train more young men to become preachers.
We can't depend on the seminaries anymore, because now we're at an age where you send your men to seminaries and the seminary teaches them different theology than they're receiving at the church. You just can't trust those guys anymore. And also what I'm seeing, one of the biggest problems in seminaries is that they're now being led by guys that just got their PhDs, who have never really spent any time in the office of pastors. Yeah. And so now seminaries are no longer places that represent the local church. It's just a bastion of academia. Yeah. And that's the last thing. I don't want academics, people that are solely academics. I don't want them training pastors. I don't want them training my men, because they're going to train them to be nothing more than academics. And even in some of the tribes that we have, we're seeing men go to seminary and say at the forefront of it, I have no plan to ever be a pastor. Well, then stop wasting your time. Drop out of seminary. Seminaries train pastors, but now we're at an era where the local church, and it should have been this all along, but we tried to cooperate so that we could do it at a better level. The local church is now the seminary. The local church is now where we got to train guys to preach and pastor. And we're working on it here. I think within the next year, we're going to have a pretty robust pastoral training curriculum here. We've really completed most of it, but we're just putting some finishing touches on it. But after that, here's the key. We've got to find men.
Yeah.
We got to find the men. And I will tell you that the North American Mission Board has more money than they've ever had. SBC seminaries have more money than they've ever had. So what's the problem? The problem is that they have no men to plant churches. Yep. They have no men to teach how to preach. They have no one that we're seeing no one want to go into ministry. And if you want to see the failure of the evangelical church in America, is that pastors have put themselves into such a position and they have talked about pastoral ministry in such a way that young men don't want to become pastors.
Yeah.
That's sad.
It's a disaster, really.
And this is the leadership of denominations. They've failed miserably.
Yeah. I mean, so this, you just said multiple things that I want to hit on. One, our church, Village Church, could plant more churches today if we had men who could preach to send out. Mm-hmm. Now we're going to do our best to rectify that. But that is the barrier.
And but that's the weak point of every church.
Right.
We're just saying at this point, we notice that that's a weak point. We've done it before. Yeah. We don't have anybody in the pipeline now, but we're going to work to fix that.
Yeah, but broader, and this is the big problem with NAM right now. NAM has hundreds of millions of dollars. We're not exaggerating this. Some people estimate they have 400 million.
Think about that.
It's ridiculous. We could plant tons of churches, but there are not the men to do it. And a lot of the men they're sending out are not good and not qualified.
Here's my question with that is because their staffs are so bloated. Yeah. I mean, NAM has so many vice presidents where at the end of their title, you're like, what does that even mean? Why aren't they planting churches?
Yeah.
If you're such an expert, if you're so good at what you're doing, why aren't you out there planting a church? Use some of that $400 million. I mean, could you imagine how awesome of a church you could plant if they just gave you $1 million?
Right.
Just gave you $1 million. You could plant a church. It would be amazing.
So the average age of pastor in America has gone from 45 to 55 in just the last decade.
Yeah, and that's worse than it sounds when you think about it.
Yeah.
Because what it means is you and I have aged, yet we're still on the young side of that. Yeah. But in the last 10 years, no one has replaced us.
No one coming up. And here's a couple things that is happening. There's a huge decline in Bible college. So young Christians just aren't going to Bible college. And a lot of times, men will get their call to ministry in Bible college. That was my story. I know that was your story in a lot of ways. And so in just Christian colleges in general, families are not prioritizing.
Parents have got to wise up. Stop sending your kids to state schools. And I say that as a pastor of a lot of people who are sending their kids to state schools. And I know you don't like it when I say it, but it's the truth. Yeah. For the sake of your child's faith, send them to a Christian college.
And then beyond that, for the sake of what they will grow to become.
Yeah.
Like we need men to be called into ministry, and we need women to be called to be wives of those men. Yeah. That happens in Christian college and Bible college. And one of the reasons we're seeing things dry up so much is because those kids aren't even entering those environments. So we've got to change that.
Yeah, and if that wasn't bad enough, our seminaries are getting soft and effeminate. And that's one of the reasons men aren't becoming pastors, is that because they're looking at what's taking place in Bible colleges. And I'm so tired of meeting guys that tell me they want to plant churches and want us to financially support them. And I meet him, and he's a soft-handed, effeminate guy. And I'm just like, I am never going to steward the money of Village Church to prop up an effeminate pastor.
Yep. As the culture war has intensified, our seminaries have not kept up. I mean, they are still training men like it's 2005, not 2023. And that's got to change. Southeastern, they recently just got rid of a feminist who they had employed for several years.
Can we celebrate for a minute that Karen Pryor has resigned from, and I don't know if she was pushed out.
It sounded like she was.
Her announcement makes me think that she was pushed out. Karen Pryor is not a Christian. Karen Pryor is a progressive, postmodernist, quote unquote Christian. Yeah. And one of the saddest things was when Southeastern hired her because she's an awful person.
And you want to look at why your enrollment's down. It's because you hired her.
And you propped her up as if this was what was supposed to be bringing in the guys to be pastors. Like, how stupid is that?
So, that's a victory, but it should have never happened in the first place. And we're, if we want to see more men entering seminary, masculine men qualified for ministry, many more things like that are going to happen. To face what's coming in the culture, the church has got to get serious about training men for real masculine ministry.
I'll tell you, one of the things that I think drove both of us into ministry was because we were put in situations in college where we had strong masculine leadership that showed us that you must be masculine in order to lead the Church of Jesus Christ. And we've even seen where liberty is concerned, that's fallen off. That's they're not maintaining that same vision, and we've got to recover that vision in our seminaries. But I think that the future of seminary is going to be the local church, and we've got to lead in such a way to show that, number one, being a pastor is the call of God on men. Yeah. But secondly, it's a great life. I think parents are convinced for some reason that if their son wants to become a pastor, that it's going to be a less than life. I love my life.
Tying this all the way back to our first episode where we started this kind of series about the state of the church and the state of the evangelical church, it's been a great 2 years of ministry.
Oh, man.
I love pastoring this church.
I am more encouraged than I ever have been in leading a church.
Yep. Ever. So thank you all for being part of our church.
Absolutely.
And we hope you've enjoyed these episodes.
Yeah, this is the end of part 3 of our series on the state of the local church as well as the American church in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us.